The very order of things is designed for trouble. It would seem then that a study of problem solving would be a useful enterprise, right? But there's not that much written about it specifically. But the argument here is that pragmatist thinking can help in the design of an effective problem-solving practice. I emphasize practice. Right? After all, the pragmatists argue for a more realistic ethic, that improvement, progress is not made through a march towards some utopian ideal of a good, but by correcting what is problematic in the matter. Academic progress, quote unquote, writes Philip Kitcher, is progress from as well as to overcoming problems in the current state. The first step for such a project is proposing a normative framework, which is my task here. Here's my case in a nutshell. If, as James Wallace argues, practices have evolved to solve particular problems of how to attain certain ends, then an abduction can be built up from their failures as to what norms are most conducive to the end of problem solving. And at the same time, because practices generally employ forms of practical reasoning, the normative features that practical reasoning process might provide a key to the better normative framework for a problem-solving practice. As Sharon Liszka writes, despite the fact that the pragmatist says that we must start our theory with ongoing practice, that theory can provide us with a guide for future practice, end of quote. So this is the short version, long version follows. So first, what is a problem, right? I surveyed many definitions of problem, and generally speaking, it's pretty consistent definitions. It's usually understood as some difficulty in overcoming an obstacle to a goal. So here are some of the many sources that I've referred to. Consequently, problem solving typically involves finding a way to overcome that obstacle. These definitions suggest three basic elements of a problem: a desired or intended goal or end, a barrier to achieving that end, and some difficulty in how to remove the barrier. Very intuitive, right? Yeah. So barriers block the attainment of ends, and therefore barriers create two kinds of agents: agreements on one side of the barrier and blockers on the other. When a multitude of people seek similar ends, competition for those ends makes problems inevitable. When a multitude of people seek conflicting ends, problems are inevitable. At the same time, to overcome any barrier needs the cooperation of others, another problem. So nothing but problems. This pursuit of ends at scale creates what David Kopp calls the fundamental problem of sociality: how to maximize cooperation in the pursuit of ends while minimizing conflict. Yeah. Okay. Hello? Yeah, good. Yeah. So to solve the fundamental problem of sociality, societies delimit which paths can be taken to which ends by which people in the network of possible ends. Societies build paths towards certain ends and barriers towards others. These tend to become practices, habits, as the pragmatists call them, ways of doing or not doing certain things to attain those ends. They result from the experience of living with others over time. They propose to solve particular problems, from how to get food, how to prepare and eat it, to how to build a home, to how to make a community safe, to how to treat other people, to how to govern a society. They become institutionalized, formalized, bureaucratized, even as they are subject to change. In doing so, they create a third type of agent, we might call the broker, agents of the practice who have the authority, coercive power, wherewithal, skill, or competence to affect the ends of the practice and mediate conflicts between grievance and blockers. Practical life is lived through such practices. It is through practices that people learn what is desirable and learn how to attain it. All societies have a set of endorsable ends and endorsable means to attain them. Gainful employment is an endorsable path to wealth, theft is not. It is in the living experience of a family, for example, that people may positively come to desire to love and be loved, to acquire the tender sentiments related to children. The living experience of a practice may negatively move people to desire something more, different, or better, just as women of the 20th century wanted more than wifeliness, or the American colonists of the 18th century wanted something better than monarchy, but now have voted it back. Any practice exists in a network of other practices, and each practice is a system of practices. Universities involve teaching, research, administrative, finance, recruitment, promotion, political advocacy, certification, maintenance, each of which have subroutines, practices within practices. Teaching involves lecturing, discussion, testing, grading, classroom management, among others. Most institutionalized and bureaucratized practices have internal and external governing practices that, in principle, serve to correct it. Universities monitor quality of instruction and research through periodic review and teaching. A board of trustees directs the institution that is evaluated externally through accredited organizations. Because practices direct people about how best, propose anyways, right? How best to do something to attain some end, they are inherently normative. They say what is prudent, necessary, required, or forbidden in order to attain ends that are in turn socially endorsed. For this reason, not all barriers are problems, but can prevent problems. Such norms take the form of rules, standards, folkways, customs, sentiments, virtues, codes, duties, rights, conventions, mores, procedures, recipes, and laws. Practices as a form of practical reasoning. As Ellen Gibbard writes, quote, the primary questions people face are, quote, ones of what to do, what to aim for, and how. Jane Addams, the pragmatist, 19th century pragmatist, notes, we slowly learn that life consists of processes as well as results, and that failure may come quite as easily from ignoring the adequacy of one's method as from selfish or ignoble aims. Both the practices that are utilized and the people using the practices engage in some sort of collective means and type of reasoning. Practical reasoning, as philosophers call it. It's the same sort of reasoning that practices employed to solve their problems are also the sort of reasoning that's needed to address problematic practices. Practical reasoning, therefore, may provide the key to the design of an effective problem-solving practice. Although there are several variants of practical reasoning, a general pattern can be discerned. Practical reasoning involves the relation among what ends people desire, intend, want, or need, what they believe will attain those ends, and what can be concluded from that desire and belief. In later work, Peirce formulates the pragmatic maxim as a version of practical reasoning. I've tried to make this case. He acknowledges that pragmatism is, quote unquote, scarce more than a corollary to Alexander Bain's account of belief, understood as, quote, that upon which a man is prepared to act. However, Bain's original formulation follows the parameters of practical reasoning. Belief is preparedness to act for a given end in a given way. And so it expresses the core features of practical reasoning. Peirce makes this clear in the Harvard Lectures of 1903. There he reformulates the pragmatic maxim in terms of what Kant called hypothetical or pragmatic imperatives, hence the name pragmatic Peirce adopts. Right? These are prudential rules, according to Kant, for how to best attain ends. In other words, forms of practical reasoning. A theoretical claim, Peirce writes, is better clarified when it is transposed into a practical one. A practical belief, in turn, engenders, quote unquote, a habit of deliberate behavior directed to some end or purpose. Putting this all together, to use a classical example, if, for example, the theoretical hypothesis that diamonds are scratch hard is true, then the practical hypothesis that diamonds will cut glass is also true. Consequently, if people desire to cut glass, use a diamond cutter, which is the hypothetical imperative. A theoretical claim is true to the extent that its practical translation leads to success in attaining its end. I would say that's one of the primary theses of pragmatism. As Kwame Appiah writes, if all our beliefs pertaining to our end were true, then the actions we undertook on those beliefs would satisfy our desires, end of quote. So, problems with practices. Although practices are designed to solve problems, they can obviously become problems. Right? First, they may not be very well designed to solve their target problems. The League of Nations was poorly designed to meet its aim to prevent another world war. Second, even if practices do solve their target problems, they may cause more problems than they solve. The internet is an elegant solution to efficient communication, but it has caused well-known problems of misinformation, hacking, and the negative impacts of social media. Third, practices tend to become outmoded and need to be adapted to other practices in their network. Think of how educational practices are now affected by ChatGPT. Fourth, even if practices are well designed, they may become corrupt through the machinations of their practitioners. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners estimates that organizations lose about 5% of their revenue to some form of fraud annually. Fifth, even if practices do not work, they remain in place because they benefit those who have the power to retain them. Despite all the gun problems in the U.S. and the support of a majority of the U.S. population in favor of stricter gun laws, the powerful gun lobbies have prevented any significant gun reform. Sixth, even if practices do solve their target problems, people may not have the capability, opportunity, or wherewithal to get what the practice affords. According to the World Health Organization, a third of the global population does not have access to safe drinking water. Over 800 million people face global hunger. Half of the human population is not fully covered by essential health services. Seventh, the norms that govern practices may themselves be or become problematic. William James emphasized that, quote, someone's good gets butchered in every system of rules. Norms that permitted slavery, prevented the enfranchisement of women, or the illegality of LGBTQ rights, all became barriers in a long struggle to overcome. Finally, practices might not only be ill-designed, but designed specifically for ill, to oppress, to persecute, to discriminate. What are the practices of problem solving? So every practice has a subroutine. What are the subroutine of problem solving? Practices evolve over time to solve the particular problems about how to attain means to ends. They employ practical reasoning in order to solve those problems. Consequently, practical reasoning and problem solving are coincidental. Practical reasoning is a practice for both designing best practices and in solving problematic ones. Analysis of practical reasoning shows easily enough that it has three critical subroutines, familiar practices within practices. These address three basic questions. What is the problem? What is the solution? And what's to be done? The first involves what Kitcher calls conversation, and others do as well. The second, inquiry, and the third, deliberation. Each has a specific aim. The aim of conversation is to come to an understanding of the problematic situations. What is the problem? How should it be represented? The aim of inquiry is to find workable solutions, practical hypotheses, which, if implemented properly, are claimed to resolve the problem satisfactorily. The aim of deliberation is to come to an agreement about what to do given the candidate solutions. The three practices of inquiry, deliberation, and conversation are interdependent. Despite different ends, they work together to solve a problem best, I would say. Clearly, if people don't understand what the problem is, or do not consider the grievances legitimate, then inquiry and deliberation are fruitless. No matter how much people might agree about a solution to a problem, if it doesn't work, the problem will not be solved. Even if a solution is touted by the best experts, unless those affected by the problem can agree to the solution, it will not work. Imposing a solution on an unwilling group can foil even the best solution. So that is why they're interdependent. The three processes are also intradependent. Each has aspects that mirror one another. Inquiry involves aspects of conversation and deliberation among fellow inquirers. Conversation involves elements of inquiry in terms of gathering information and establishing facts, and deliberation about the seriousness of the problem. Deliberators must assess the result of inquiries, come to an understanding of the interests and beliefs of others before coming to an agreement on a solution. So there's a lot of mirroring that goes on in the process. So what might be the overarching normative features of problem solving? As Bernard Williams argues, there is a central norm of practical reasoning. He calls it the prudential norm. That one ought to do what is likely to attain what one desires. In fact, he claims it's irrational if you do what you don't think will attain what you want, right? Although this might suggest that all practical reasoning is egoistic, this is not necessarily so, since the ends and means of practical reasoning are filtered through practices, and practices are the result of collective practical reasoning, which often creates barriers to egoistic tendencies by filtering ends and means. The primary moral sentiment of problem solving is what might be called the meliorist sentiment, the simple desire to make things better, not just for oneself, but as a whole. It is expressed by Peirce's notion of evolutionary love, to repair what is hateful and to pass on what is good. It seems like a primary sentiment. I know there, listened to a couple of papers on agapistic ethics that I think capture this idea. Without this sentiment, practitioners cannot be counted on in sincerely aiming at the ends of their practices. If they're doing the practice for their own benefit and not for the end of the practice, it's corruption, right? And you have problematic practices as a result. When the sentiment falters, it creates what Kitcher calls altruism failures to attend to the misery of others and to attend to the and not to attend to the endorsable ends of others. James thinks to ignore, quote unquote, the cry of the wounded, those suffering a problem, is a fatal mistake. Based on the work of pragmatists and those friendly to its philosophy, there are 5 overarching norms of problem solving. These should be familiar to those who know the scholars listed here: Appel, Cohen, Dewey, Habermas, Hochway, Kitcher, Misak, Schuch, Talese, and myself. First, a principle of inclusion. Those who suffer a problem should be included in its resolution, but all those affected by it should be as well. When this fails, problems are not properly represented, local knowledge is lost, and the grievances of those who suffer the problem continue. Second, a principle of non-coercion. Participants in problem-solving practices should feel free to defend their positions and criticize others without fear of coercion or force. Those in power can end a problem by force, but violence and coercion does not solve it. Third, adherence to the norms of speech practices, conversation, inquiry, deliberation are constituted by a variety of speech practices, such as asserting, representing, narrating, listening, asking, and the like. In agreement with Robert Brandam's concept of normative pragmatics, such speech practices involve certain commitments of the speaker and entitlements of the interlocutor that should be followed. Deception, insincerity, and strategic communication, as Habermas argues, foils the ends of good deliberation and makes inquiries unsuccessful. Fourth, the principle of equality of participation. Although not all arguments or opinions are equal, whether it is conversation, inquiry, or deliberation, all participants should have the same opportunities to engage in speech practices relevant to problem solving. Failure to do so questions the results of deliberation and foils proper inquiry. Fifth, a principle of consensus. Some variety of consensus should be the primary determination of the principal aim in each of the practices of conversation, inquiry, and deliberation. Evidence points to egalitarian practices as more successful generally than autocratic ones in solving problems in their domain. So let's look a little bit at the normative features of each of the 3 aspects of problem solving. So for conversation, typically there are 3 stages. The representation of the situation as problematic by grievance. People are complaining, there's an issue, there's a problem, here it is. And blockers typically say, no, there's no problem, this is a misrepresentation, and so forth and so on. What follows typically is a clarification and establishment of factual claims, leading to a determination whether to count the situation as genuinely problematic. Kitcher calls the latter the quote-unquote justified acceptance of a situation as problematic, ideally employing a diagnostic tool, one that would show where the problems lie and where they don't, whether you could do that or not. Juridical practices, such as the practice, let's say in the Supreme Court, model some of these features. Both sides of a problematic case represent their positions to the panel of justices, who ask questions and ask for clarifications, with defenses of the litigants, ending in a ruling that resolves the issue. So, standard example. The moral sentiments most associated with conversation are empathy, understood as a capacity for understanding another, and sympathy, which is actual compassion for the suffering of others. The virtues most associated with conversation are those central to the ethic of care: attentiveness, responsiveness, respect. The principle of inclusion demands that those who claim to suffer a problem have a right to express their grievances and have a voice in representing the case. This is, for example, in the First Amendment of the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, that the public has a right to express its grievances. This also holds for blockers and those in the public who have any standing. Not all grievances are genuinely problematic. Most are, though. Yeah. The other 4 principles apply as well. However, Kitcher argues that in conversation, the determination of whether a situation counts as problematic in the 3rd stage is if it is endorsed by the participants, so long as the endorsement follows the normative conditions of conversation. However, many practices restrict the consensus to a supposedly neutral set of brokers like the Supreme Court panel, since conflicts between grievance and blockers often make consensus difficult. Jane Addams comes to mind as a pragmatist most representative of the practice of conversation. Hull House was a model guided by her concept of associative ethics, ways of including the impoverished in dealing with the problem of poverty and other local issues. Her masterful rhetorical strategies for representing conflicts between grievance and blockers comes out in her essay, A Modern Lear, an attempt to address the conflict between labor and management and the momentous Pullman strike of 1894 in the U.S., which led to 70 deaths and many injuries. Her goal in such rhetoric was to play back their representations of the situation and to get away from factional thinking to a we by means of co-creating the future, what Kenneth Burke called dialogical identification. Even her diagnosis of conspiracy theories, which are ripe presently, right? In The Devil's Baby, her essay, The Devil's Baby, illustrate the attitude of sympathy as a means of getting to the underlying problem of those who advocate such conspiracy. What's underlying those things? Sympathy and understanding of the problems of others are core to her social ethics and an identification generally with the common lot. How about some of the normative features of inquiry? Well, once a situation has been counted as problematic, it becomes a matter of finding a solution, which typically involves inquiry. The norms of inquiry have been well studied by Peirce and Peirce-inspired thinkers, a common list of people that you're probably familiar with. And they're mostly expressed in the 5 overarching norms of problem solving. Inquiry is unlikely to attain its goal of truth if there are violations of these overarching norms. It's hard to imagine that inquiry would be successful if the give and take of criticism were restricted, or those with opposing ideas were excluded from the inquiry, or people refused to justify their positions. Peirce's arguments about speech practices such as assertion are similar to Brandam's in that those who make claims are committed to provide reasons and justifications to others. Peirce saw inquiry as exemplified by science, but not just a matter of good method, but as a practice, a community of inquiry. Inquiry, in turn, relied deeply on quote-unquote moral factors that were vital to the practice. They were essential for cooperation and solidarity. In various work, he outlines these quote-unquote moral factors in terms of sentiments, virtues, and norms. Since the end of inquiry is truth, the most fundamental sentiment of inquirers is the love of truth. These included altruistic sentiments toward the community of inquiry itself. Inquirers share an intergenerational altruism and understanding that one's work may not reap a benefit for oneself, but for those that come later. In addition to these moral sentiments, inquirers must exercise certain epistemic virtues. Peirce recognized the obvious: honesty, fair-mindedness, industry, humility. These are also well articulated by Robert Talisse. In The Fixation of Belief, Peirce emphasizes that true beliefs are not likely if people hold on to beliefs tenaciously despite evidence, or if they believe something simply because it serves their interests. True beliefs are unlikely if they are imposed by authority, coercion, or force. True beliefs are unlikely if people believe merely on the basis of what others believe. How about deliberation, normative features of deliberation? Once solutions have been proposed to solve a problem, there needs to be a deliberation about which to implement. John Dewey is the pragmatist most associated with deliberation. John Shook argues that Dewey sees the two processes of inquiry and deliberation working together. A problem arises, there's a conflict of interests, a public is formed around people affected by the same social problem, And the aim of deliberation is to bring out these conflicts into the open where they can be discussed and judged in the light of more inclusive interests than are represented by either of them separately. The very act of deliberation creates this kind of public interest. As Shook notes, Dewey held that the proper function of politics, for example, is to manage social conflict for the benefit of all involved. This public enlists the aids of relevant expertise. According to Dewey, experts formulate hypotheses to suggest a course of action most likely to solve the problem. With the aid of expert inquirers, the public agrees about what modifications to social structures or norms are needed to alleviate the problem. The consequences are observed. Either the problem is ameliorated or the process returns to consider another solution. Dewey famously said that although the shoemaker knows how to make an expert shoe, it's the wearer who knows where it fits, right? So this is good. Dewey characterizes public deliberation as one that involves practices of consultation, conference, persuasion, and discussion, all of which require the overarching norms of problem solving. Quote, guarantees of free inquiry, free assembly, and free communication. If engaged in properly, it is, quote unquote, self-corrective in the long run. Many of the same norms tied to inquiry apply to deliberation with some important differences. For one, the aims of deliberation and inquiry are different. For inquiry, the aim is truth. The aim of deliberation, as Dewey notes, is to come to an agreement. Although inquiry involves an agreement, a convergence of beliefs among inquirers, as Peirce would say, the consensus is constrained by evidence and defining events independent of what the inquirer might happen to believe. On the other hand, in deliberation, the coin of the realm are the deliberator's beliefs as tied to their interests. The effort to get another to believe as one does implies a number of normative attitudes, as Misak and Habermas point out. If people truly believe what they believe and aim to get others to believe as they do, they must be open to opportunities for others to ask questions, to criticize, to challenge those beliefs. Clearly, people are unlikely to be persuaded if they are refused these opportunities. Importantly, interest cannot be solely based on self-interest, as Joshua Cohen argues. Quote, while I may take my preferences as a sufficient reason for advancing a proposal, deliberation under conditions of pluralism requires that I find reasons that make the proposals acceptable to others who cannot be expected to regard my preferences as sufficient reasons for agreeing. Cohen argues that the practice of deliberation makes it more likely that there will be sincere representation of beliefs. Precisely because there is a goal of agreement, then a proposal that looks to a more common good will prevail over one that benefits a few. If there's a sentiment most associated with deliberation, it is the desire for solidarity. Solidarity implies an agreement about ends and means to those ends. Solidarity fosters group unity and fellow feeling, a lessening of polarization, which we all experience to a great degree now. So let me make my conclusion. For Dewey, Misak writes, quote, the pragmatist must see morality and politics as problem-driven. Kitcher agrees. Quote, to advance the Deweyan goal of making our moral progress more sure-footed, proposals about how morally problematic situations might be identified, about how efforts to cope with what has been judged as problematic might be directed, and the conditions under which those efforts should bring about moral change, end of quote, are needed. What has been offered here is an outline of a normative architecture for an effective problem-solving practice. At the same time, the proposal here begs the question of its justification. But what is presented here is more of an abduction than a proof. An abduction, like all good abductions, is based on what is wrong with the previous hypotheses, or in this case, failed practices. So the ultimate test of the validity of these norms, however, must be their test and experience. If implemented properly, conjoined with proper organization, methods, and techniques, will they be conducive to the end of solving problems? That's the question, the next question, right? Pragmatist, as Kitcher argues, that, quote, there's no ethical justification for following a rule unless one has grounds for viewing that rule as authoritative, and those grounds can come only from recognizing the rules as well adapted to producing good outcomes. Following rules not well adapted to producing good outcomes is a capricious and irresponsible thing to do, end of quote. In explaining the pragmatist doctrine, William James claims that the true and the good should be understood as that which will carry us prosperously from any one part of our experience to any other part, and leads us away from clash and contradiction. As Peirce would say, the norms are justified if they are conducive towards their ends. This is the prudential norm writ large. The measure of the correctness of a claim is the success of the action it guides. Problem solving also encapsulates Peirce's notion of reasonableness, understood not as a static end to be achieved, but an ongoing process of self-correction towards something better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Liszka. We have questions, please. Professor Colapietro, Professor Lúcia. Microphone is yours.
Thank you. I intend this as a friendly amendment. I don't know that it's going to sound very friendly. So if we talk about this situation in light of the world today, in terms of just for a moment, in terms of how, if we talk about this in terms of the situation today, if we talk about in terms of Hamas and Gaza, my good friend, the Irish American, who was a very fine James scholar, Bill Gavin, would say, there are problems and there are troubles. And if we're going to deal with problems, we need to confront the troubles. Because if some group murders our children en masse, we have more than a problem. And if we in turn kill their children en masse, we have more than a problem. So what I want, here's my friendly amendment. I think that the resources of pragmatism are inadequate. I think they're necessary but not sufficient. And for a fully normative framework, we need to mobilize the resources of the Marxian tradition and do deep socioeconomic analysis as part of any conversation or deliberation. And because the social pathologies are so profound and pervasive, we need to mobilize the resources of the psychoanalytic tradition. Nothing less than the marriage of Freud, Marx, and the pragmatists will be adequate for a normative framework.
Well, thank you, Vincent, for the compliment. But I think you are an expert that is proposing a solution to a problem that may or may not work, that would be better addressed through processes that we know now are probably about the best we have. I'm not saying they're good, they're absolutely satisfactorily good or perfect, but essentially democratic processes. And yeah, now the question, I mean, the problems you mentioned are almost insurmountable. They're very difficult. Once people go to war, extremely difficult to resolve. What are the practices that we use? Well, we're using the practices, trained negotiation, and which is a degenerate form of conversation and so forth. Yeah, so I agree. I mean, I agree with you, but I don't think we can impose. I think there has to be an evolution of practices. Sometimes the evolution can be very radical, as biological evolution is sometimes radical, and changes. But I don't think we're going to get anywhere other than, if we just propose ideas to solve the problem. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we have to, I mean, we have to recognize that there's all sorts of pathology. Is that your point? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So I think I mean, providing the normative framework is just the tip of the tip of the iceberg. You also have to find a way to organize with practices, with methods, techniques, and so forth. I mentioned a few that Jane Addams used. Another good example is what's called direct democracy. Latest experiment was in France. It sort of models some of this idea of relation between expertise and deliberation. The model in France didn't quite contain anything about conversation first, but there were methods and techniques and the way in which it was organized. The deliberators, who were just randomly chosen from the citizen population, came up with pretty good proposals to address climate change, for example. But the problem was that the legislature, the French legislature, didn't follow through with those. Right. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Working? Is it working?
You have to speak a little longer. No.
Bem pertinho. No.
Yeah.
Not working. Okay? Okay. The lecture I thought it was perfect
Oh.
before listening to Colapietro. It's true. It's true what he said.
Yeah.
Because we cannot talk about anything today without considering geopolitical problems.
Yeah. No.
Geopolitical problems, because we are living in a world of a war of beliefs,
Yeah.
and the consequence. But I want to speak about another thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn the problem to another problem.
Okay.
Okay. We cannot speak about the humans today, ignoring artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Impossible. Okay. But necessary. This meeting was very important for me because I merged in artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to say is that artificial intelligence today, the key of AI is the solution of problems.
Yeah.
How does that work? It works. The developers choose a data,
Mm-hmm.
huge amount of data. They have to choose. So there is human deliberation there. Then they train, domesticate an algorithm,
Mm-hmm.
choosing a neural network.
Mm-hmm.
And the neural networks, they work alone.
Yeah.
That's called black box.
Yeah.
Okay, but they come to the solution. They come to the solution
Mm-hmm.
very quickly.
Yeah.
It's automated.
Yeah.
That's why AI is so successful,
Yeah.
because it turns capitalism even quicker than it usually is. Now, your lecture made me think. There is a final phase where human deliberation could and should enter when the humans have to judge the consequences of the final solution to which artificial intelligence comes. Unfortunately, this final phase, which is called curatorial phase, has not been so emphasized in artificial intelligence. And it's then that a lecture like yours is so precious and necessary. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, I agree that we might be able to employ artificial intelligence in inquiry as one aspect of problem solving. But to really, truly solve the problems, you need those who are affected by those problems to deliberate about those consequences. So I agree with you perfectly, Lucia. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you, Liszka, for this very inspiring lecture. I was thinking if, in addition to problem solving, we could also think on problem dissolving. Maybe many problems are a matter of misunderstanding and miscommunication. So
yes.
When you put in different sides the grievance and the blockers, maybe what we need is something like a strategy to weld them together, as Peirce would say. And I remember when I read your book on Peirce's theory of science, actually, I would love to see this lecture turned into a semiotic version of it, in which you would think more in semiotic terms what you were saying. But I remember that you were proposing, correct me if I'm wrong, in the very end of your book, you propose something like coduction. Instead of abduction, we should need something like a coduction, which would be like a communicative version of abduction. And I think this could be a way to weld together the grievance and blockers and maybe get rid of some misunderstandings that make us see problems when probably there is more misunderstanding of how we experience reality.
Yes, that I agree. That's a very good point, and I think that if the first phase of problem solving, conversation, is properly organized, how to do that, what sort of techniques should be used and this sort of thing, then maybe some problems can be dissolved, as you say, oh, okay, well, we misunderstood one another, and now we can right the ship or right the wrong, or there is no wrong, or something like that. Yeah, there are lots of, I wouldn't say lots, but there are some models of conversation, like racial healing conversations, where the goal is to come to understand how the minority, the grievant, the subject of racial prejudice and so forth, and those who may or may not understand their own prejudice come to understand their prejudices. And then there's a transformation of conduct or behavior that usually results where people attend to those offenses and those prejudices and those biases, and that helps to dissolve some of the problem. I mean, it doesn't solve the problem, but it dissolves some of it. Yeah, but that's an excellent point. Yes, excellent. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. There is a distinction between well-formulated problems. In the literature, there is a distinction between well-formulated problems and ill-formulated problems. To give a machine an AI to deal with problems, you have to have a well-formulated problem. I wonder if the real problems we have in contemporary society are a second type of ill
Yes.
problems, formulated problems. What would be an answer from pragmatist perspective about this distinction in contemporary society?
Yeah, this distinction between well-formed and ill-formed problems results from complex systems. So a complex system is a deterministic system, but it's very hard to predict the outcomes. Right? So if you have, you might think of practices as in a complex network of nodes and paths. And if you adjust one of the practices, it affects many other practices in the network. And so it's very difficult, therefore, to predict all the consequences of a solution to the practice in one problem. The problem in one practice. I hope I made myself clear. So if the practices form this complex network, we can think of a practice as a node or paths to certain ends. And if you adjust one of these in the complex system, then it affects the others in an indeterminate way. I mean, you can't predict all the consequences. So I think you have, the only thing you can do is, for example, the weather is a complex system, and we have difficulty predicting the paths of hurricanes, but we're getting better at it. I mean, we have more techniques and models in which to do that. So I don't think we can always predict all the consequences of an adjustment to a practice, but we might get better and better at it the more we do it, and the more we understand the complexity of the system. So that I think that's the best we can do. Yeah, but you're right to point out those what they call wicked problems, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Liszka. Thank you, everyone. I invite you to a coffee break. Thank you.
Very good. That's what I'm aiming at. Well,
I like the question. It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
You did it, you know.
Yeah.
Não, eu preciso de ajuda. I need a little help from my friend.
Quer que eu fique aqui passando?
Não, acho que o Bob, eu só quero tirar esse aqui e colocar esse. Acho que esse aqui é do Liszka, inclusive. Você tira esse pendrive, Lúcia, eu vou perguntar para ele se é dele. E o outro é do...
Não, esse daqui acho que não é o pendrive. Isso aqui é do controle.
You're checking. Huh? You're checking.
You're checking?
Yes.
Professor, yes, I'm here to help, whatever you need. And to learn.
We know that because
To learn with you. I'm very anxious for your lecture.
You like what-
Yes.
the things on
I
painting
read
and
it,
when to put the
and they
brush down.
have
Huh?
fantastic.
I thought,
As always, you bring some
that's good.
light for us.
I appreciate the reaction because I need somebody who really knows something to say, hey, that works.
Yes, yes, I love it.
Good.
Vamos ver, Lúcia, se está funcionando.
Ah,
eu...
não. Ok, vai. Pergunta para a Heloísa se tem outro pendrive do Innis, porque esse daqui não está além.
Não, ela disse que está em todo... Esse aí é um arquivo geral.
Tá.
Não está lendo?
Não. Vamos testar nesse daqui. Esse daqui de quem é?
Esse é computador de apoio. Esse aqui é porque eles estão vendo.
Então, mas ele não está abrindo esse aqui. Ele não está abrindo.
Nem não está lendo, nem isso.
Não está lendo. Oi, professor. Oi, querido. Tudo bom? Manda foto para mim. Eu, terça-feira de manhã, estou lá. Nessa terça aqui, eu estarei lá. Então, eu vou lá na sala. Tá? Se precisar de alguma coisa. Então, se ela precisar de alguma coisa, eu estarei lá.
Na verdade, a primeira ação, Peirce, foi substituída pelo Pragmatismo. A próxima mediador, de dia 19,
Parece que não está abrindo.
Abriu.
Ele abriu os outros dias, né?
Tá.
É,
Tá dando, ó, esse arquivo não
Você
tem
consegue acessar
aplicativo
no-
associado a ele
É.
para executar essa
o
ação.
que é isso? Quem, ó?
Esse
tem
é o-
como reparar? É o meu que está usando
Não
todo
tem,
dia.
ele não tá, ele tá com alguma...
Põe noutra entrada.
Já tentei.
Está na minha,
Eu
tá na
tava
minha
querendo,
mochila.
eu tava querendo abrir nesse daqui, mas ela falou que não pode mexer.
É,
Eu vou inserir algumas coisas.
Aí, conseguiu, né?
Não, ele tá pedindo aplicativos outros. Ó, esse arquivo não tem aplicativo associado a ele para executar esta ação. Instale o aplicativo ou, caso exista, já instalar. Configuração de aplicação padrão.
É, melhor.
Sim, mas eles não tem outro pendrive.
Então, perguntei para o vocês têm coordenadas,
Ô,
têm como...
Heloísa?
Ó, tem- voltou.
Não, isso aí é o que já está no folder. Bom, nós temos o arquivo do Innis. Você tem outro. Esse daqui não está funcionando.
Tem como ver?
Ele
se eu
não tá-
puder, eu mandei pelo WhatsApp, mas
exato.
o Luiz, se eu puder abrir meu e-mail, o Luiz me mandou, porque foi, não, esse não foi o Luiz que preparou. Quem que preparou esse? Tá no nosso e-mail,
Quem
porque
preparou, acho que foi a Silvana.
a Silvana que preparou. Se a gente abrir o e-mail que
Não,
a
a
Silvana
Fi-
mandou,
deixa
ela
eu ver.
mandou só por WhatsApp?
Só
Tem como abrir o
deixa eu
WhatsApp
ver,
aí?
Deixa eu ver se, se foi a Silvana.
Nesse computador também não abre?
Mas eu tenho, ela falou que não pode mexer.
computador do suporte.
Mas eu queria...
Eu pedi ajuda para eles.
nós vamos projetar a fala.
Projeto e conclusão.
Exato.
Arthur,
Tá pronto.
eu fiz outro recibo de diária.
Vocês preencheu?
Não precisa preencher, só assina para mim, eu vou pôr teu nome. O valor é um pouco diferente, em vez de 1.000.
Tá aqui o do Innis. Eu vou abrir meu WhatsApp.
Não, eu fiz errado de novo. Fiz errado. Eu mando para você. É que mudou o valor da diária de CNPq agora em outubro. Eu vi ontem. Tudo.
Você vai mandar para mim?
Era para eu ter mudado o valor aqui. Eu mando, você assina com o GovBR.
Tá.
Né?
Tá bom.
Porque não é 1.800, é
Eu vou
1.900.
abrir o WhatsApp aqui. Pegar os três.
Tá bom. Não, aí você me manda, eu assino com...
Agora é. Tudo bem. Já?
Você que... A gente vai fazer uma homenagem com eu quero abrir. Logo depois do debate,
Não aqui para
chama nós três. Eu gostaria de chamar.
Não tem como abrir minha nuvem. Eu posso entrar no meu OneDrive.
Não, a gente tem os três arquivos no WhatsApp.
Você está abrindo o WhatsApp aí? Não, eu mandei tudo no WhatsApp agora.
Deixa eu ver, é outra pessoa que está aqui. Novos milionários. Vamos sair dessa conta, desconectar. Desconectar. Os arquivos ficam muito concentrada, só que aqui está aparecendo.
Tem como desligar esse monitor? Tem como desligar?
Eu posso tomar um cafezinho?
Pode.
Vai tranquilo.
Vou pegar só um cafezinho.
Esse é problema nosso, pode ir lá.
Vem lá.
Depois, no final,
Resolver.
eu vocês, né?
Oi.
Quando terminar, eu chamo vocês três.
Da gente conseguir abrir o arquivo aqui a tempo.
Qual arquivo que não está?
Nenhum. Mas até eles chegarem, a gente está tentando um plano B.
Porque a gente teria que abrir e, antes do início da conferência, usar esse computador para editar um PowerPoint.
É complexo.
Tá?
É
Isso aqui é
complexo.
uma quatro.
Você fala e diz assim, ó, tem um trecho aqui que
Aí não vai aparecer
não vai aparecer na tela, você fala. Tá?
Bom, eu coloquei no nosso grupo, né? Então, eu coloquei no nosso grupo.
Eu mandei agora no grupo.
Dá para você mandar de novo os três arquivos do grupo que eu baixar? Aí é melhor porque também não fica na Arthur, acho melhor você ir um pouquinho mais para lá por causa do... Grande açúcar. Ah, essa daqui?
You're like a
E agora?
bartender, but there's no
Mais lá fora.
behind the counter.
Eu ainda estou na frente, agora não, né?
Ok? Ok, quer que eu siga? Eu?
Like this?
Sim.
Checking, 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 checking.
Saí.
You can hear me say I'm,
Vou sair. Eu vou sair.
I'm sorry.
Eu vou- Obrigado pela visão.
Adriana,
Well, I can try to do it. My thing is that I always lecture, I never lecture sitting down. So I asked, could I stand up?
There a way to get that mic in here? E aí, podemos começar?
E aquele tinha suporte lá no aqui não tem.
Podemos começar?
So it's up to you. I want her to hold it. She said she will do it happily.
Okay. That way you can see the reaction. If they say louder, louder, you will then be able to move it.
And you also have
você tem como pegar ele,
by your side.
você tem como pegar
I'm
ele
well aware of
isso,
that.
e aí depois a hora que ele começar
I was not tempted to say
fechar
no.
essa tela. Essa tela primeiro, enquanto ele chama. A hora que ele começar a falar, que a gente vai passar a tela, você vai focar nele. Como assim, controle?
Lúcia,
Controle. Não, mas você pode virar a mão para cá e para cá.
podemos começar?
Para cá para pegar.
Eu vou sair, eu vou sentar de cá. O pessoal não vai ver. Podemos começar? Pessoal, alô, alô, alô. Alô, alô, alô. Vamos começar. Well, last but not least, my pleasure to present my colleague, my dear friend, Professor Robert Innis. Bob, please.
Being the last word is not necessarily you're saying the last word. You're just saying the last words. It's very interesting to speak at the end of a meeting where a whole set of issues that I'm going to discuss are exemplified, namely the multiple voices that have been brought into play here as we have discussed a somewhat undefined topic, which has been progressively defined as we have moved along. And my paper deals with this basic problem of that I think all of us encountered, and that is, what do I have that is new that I'm going to present to the people here, to my audience? So my paper deals with that general problem of how do you find that you have been led to say what you have said, just as a painter who is in the various stages of covering a canvas with their significant strokes. When do they know at what point that they put the brush down, that what they have presented already on the canvas is exactly where they were going, although they did not know it at the beginning. So my paper takes up these issues with a number of examples that bear upon this thing, and it does it by exemplifying one of its theoretical points, namely that creativity is dialogical. It involves multiple voices, as we saw in James's paper, of where they are oriented toward and engage one another, even if they are not necessarily developed together, that they're not walking hand in hand. Well, let's see how it works out in practice. The first section, as you can see on the screen there, is called Framing Creativity and Originality between Goethe and Emerson. In Goethe's Maxims and Reflections, we find the following 4 entries. The most original authors of the day are not rated as such because they produce something new, but only because they are capable of saying this kind of thing as though it had never been said before. This is why the most attractive mark of originality, he says, is knowing how to develop a received idea so creatively that no one can easily guess how much lies hidden within it. As to those ideas, whatever they may be, such as freedom and liberation or creativity itself, many ideas appear only quite gradually, like flowers opening out among the greenery of the branches. When roses are in season, one sees roses in bloom everywhere. On this account, then, there are seasons even for creative or new ideas. Goethe offers a further specification. In the end, all depends on attitudes. Where there are mental attitudes, ideas follow, and ideas are in keeping with attitudes. Such attitudes are essentially habits, and habits arise from practices. Well, since that is the case, can production of original ideas be practiced or cultivated? What is involved in such practices? For Goethe, the greatest genius, he writes, is not worth much if he pretends to draw exclusively from his own resources. Genius, in the sense intended by Goethe, is the faculty of seizing and turning to account anything that strikes us. Indeed, he contended that closely scrutinized, the productions of artistic genius are the most part reminiscences, as he rooted in his practices of the art of appropriation. As he wrote in entry 441 of Maxims and Reflections, there's nothing clever that hasn't been thought of before. You've just got to think it all over again. Thinking something all over again is one of the permanent tasks of philosophical reflection, as one of those present here argued at this meeting several years ago. But clearly one can think something all over again, such as the nature and scope of, say, freedom and liberation, only if we have in some sense been brought to thought, whether theoretically or in our practices. One of our jobs would be to think over or rotate such concepts as freedom and liberation, which are clearly general and multidimensional notions of great and contentious breadth and depth. But even here, Goethe issues a stark warning. General notions and great conceit are always potential creators of shocking misfortune. Where does that leave us? A diverse and remarkably compatible mixture of different temperaments and deeply shared interests. Goethe also remarked, one could recognize the usefulness of an idea and yet fail to understand just how to make the best use of it. Why is that the case? If it is, could we not first of all try to articulate or arrive at the essential features and types of freedom and liberation, creativity and dialogicity, etc., perhaps through definitional stipulation or through a vast catalog of exemplary instances, both individual and social? But here Goethe notes, I encounter a Janus-faced problem or challenge. All empiricists, he writes, are on the search for ideas and cannot discover them in multiplicity. All theorists are looking for them in multiplicity and fail to discover them here. This contrast between empiricists and theorists characterizes central aspects of the approach I will take to the theme we are exploring in this, at this meeting, to the various themes we have been exploring in this meeting. Are we caught in a perpetual oscillation between the empirical and theoretical? Sapere aude, we are taught in Kant's famous admonition to us. We are urged on every front to be creative, to find our original voice, to say something new about vitally important topics, to speak out from where we are in ways not heard before, to produce works of art and take on forms of agency that shift the relational context, both individual and social, in which we carry out our lives. But Goethe, in spite of his remarkable creative and intellectual powers, makes no attempt to turn creativity and originality into some sort of fetishistic demand that we have to fulfill by a kind of liberating exercise of autonomous thought, artistic production, or ethical actions. Cognate-linked aspects are found in a set of remarks by Ralph Waldo Emerson, provoked by his encounter with and deep admiration for Goethe. Emerson was himself famously absorbed by the problem of originality and creativity. In one of his well-known passages, we read, "Why should we not have an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion of revelation to us and not the history of theirs?" Robert Richardson, in his book, First We Read, Then We Write, Emerson on the Creative Process, writes that Emerson wanted original accounts, firsthand experience, personal witness, insisting at the same time that Emerson did not deny new thoughts or the original contributions of others. They were to be measured by how much they would give back to one's own consciousness. Such thoughts and contributions arise from the type of activity, both receptive and productive, that is the work or workings of genius, an activity, Emerson asserts, which repairs the decay of things. Paradigmatically, the decays of our vital sense of life, both individual and social. I think that this notion of an originality that repairs the decays of things encompasses so much of the practical, engaged nature of philosophical reflection. This is the type of writing and practices of reading that Emerson himself engaged in with his lifelong attempts to write against the pressing weight of his realization, growing out of his encounters with Shakespeare, Goethe, and others, that all originality is relative. Every thinker is retrospective, not in the sense that the past is the explicit focus of their thinking, but rather that it furnishes the unavoidable background or enabling conditions and analytical resources upon which the thinker relies to focus on the present. Dewey calls this condition fundedness, the capital the mind has at its disposal to engage the world, an active and eager background that lies in wait and engages whatever comes in its way so as to absorb it into its own being. Its animus is toward further interactions. In the opening lines of his essay on Shakespeare, Emerson writes, "Great men are more distinguished by range and extent than by originality. The greatest genius is the most indebted man. Such indebtedness makes a mockery," he says, "of our petulant demand for originality, from which we need to be freed." For Emerson, even occasional poems can be used to give leave to originality. "We have," he writes, "a permanent debt to tradition through reading and conversation, such that there is no pure originality. All minds quote," he writes, "old and new make the warp and woof of every moment. There is no thread that is not a twist of those two strands. By necessity, by proclivity, and by delight, we all quote." Very interesting that it's a quotation of the argument for quotation. So what is originality for Emerson? It is being, he says, being oneself and reporting accurately what we see and are. Genius is, in the first sense, its sensibility, the capacity of receiving just impressions from the external world, and the power of coordinating these after the laws of thought. In this respect, Emerson concurs with Goethe's foregrounding of openness to what strikes and lures one, that pulls one on, even perhaps against one's will. Scientific originality is a distinctive and highly developed example of this. It is measured against different conceptual backgrounds of competing or merely postulated theories and unexplained phenomena that cannot be situated within existing frameworks or even pinned down for technical experimental reasons. Rosamund Harding, in her classic study, An Anatomy of Inspiration, provocatively proposed that, quote, that while the scientist creates a discovery, the artist discovers a creation. In this way, linking science and art as pathways to discovery. If then, as Emerson holds, the greatest genius, no matter in what field, is the most indebted man, this places a heavy burden on creators, as well as on those who undergo or encounter in multiple ways their products, scientific theories, philosophical speculations and analyses, works of art of all sorts. They all arise against the background of previous works and received ideas and theories, with both their support as well as their opposition. The nature of this background goes beyond art and theoretical construction to the whole domain of creative making and thinking quite generally. Each work or novel theory, each artwork or novel theory or ethical proposal or heroic action, independent of scale, makes a claim on our attention as a possible unique and worthwhile instance of a kind of thing with its distinctive feeling and qualities in the case of artworks, conceptual and empirical content in the case of a theory, or existential courage in the case of the hero. The interpreter must avoid engaging artworks with mere nodding recognition or by imposing a template of prior experiences and the embodied habits of attending that have come to inform us on many levels. And the scientist and experimenter has to show that their products are truly novel in some essential way, even if they do not break the framework they are operating in, but rather advance it in a way notably different from others. The second part of the lecture deals with the issue of beneath creativity. What lies beneath creativity? We know what lies outside of it, according to what we've just seen, but what lies beneath it? Goethe's and Emerson's way of framing the conditions of creativity and originality seems to both demystify it and to acknowledge it as an ideal, while simultaneously holding it, in Emerson's case, to be a petulant demand that in a paradoxical way traps us and binds us. Goethe's remarks admittedly have a rather high or sovereign tone to them, perhaps as befits the confident self-knowledge and self-assertion of his Apollonian powers to straddle the divide between the realm of art and the realm of scientific observation and theoretical speculations about nature. Emerson, however, with admittedly mixed motivations, was perplexed and troubled about creativity as a writer in ways quite different from Goethe. There is at its core a religious or existential tone to it, epitomized in his need to uncover or establish the grounds for an original relation to the universe, rooted in self-reliance and not on external authority. What Goethe and Emerson share, however, is a commitment to a concept of creativity or originality as a free form of thought, action, and self-formation, while admitting that it is inextricably bound to its background and enabling conditions. It is not reified nor subject to direct control. Consider this phenomenologically thick passage about these conditions from Dewey's artist experience. He says, "New ideas come leisurely, yet promptly to consciousness only when work has previously been done in forming the right doors by which they may gain entrance. Subconscious maturation precedes creative production in every line of human inquiry. The direct effort of wit and will of itself never gave birth to anything that is not mechanical. Their function is necessary, but it is let loose. It is to let loose allies that exist outside their scope. At different times, we brood over different things. We entertain purposes that, as far as consciousness is concerned, are independent, being each appropriate to its own occasion. We perform different acts, each with its own particular result. Yet, as they all proceed from one living creature, they are somehow bound together below the level of intention. Below the level of intention. They work together, and finally something is born, almost in spite of conscious personality, and certainly not because of its deliberate will. When patience has done its perfect work, the man is taken possession of and by the appropriate muse and speaks and sings as some God dictates." Dewey has often been criticized for his boring prose, but this is one of the most fantastic passages, I think, that he ever wrote. And I'm sure he did not sit down to plan to write a novel passage that would break with his previous prose works. Peirce remarked about this process that the deeper workings of spirit or psyche take place in their own slow way, without our contrivance. Such a passage as Dewey's must not be restricted to canonical artistic or creative processes. It encompasses a description of how in dialogical situations, such as we have been engaged in for the last 4 days of talking to one another and back and forth, it encompasses a description of how in dialogical situations of everydayness, we find new and right words pulled out of us that fit previously unarticulated thing meant that we are striving for in order to correspond to the demands of the situation. The educational pedagogical task for schools is to recognize the ground that has to be prepared and cultivated even for the process of waiting for the felt insight to occur. A second text from artist's experience moves us to the deep level of creative non-practice, another element in the dialogical depth grammar of creativity that is exemplified in art or in theoretical discovery, but by no means restricted to them. Dewey writes, I do not think it can be denied that an element of reverie, of approach to a state of dream, enters into the creation of a work of art, nor that the experience of the work, when it is intense, often throws one into a similar state. Indeed, it is safe to say that creative conceptions in philosophy and science come only to persons who are relaxed to the point of reverie. The subconscious fund of meaning stored in our attitudes have no chance of release when we are practically or intellectually strained, for much the greater part of this store is then restrained, because the demands of a particular problem and particular purpose inhibit all except the elements directly relevant. Images and ideas come to us not by set purpose, but in flashes, and flashes are intense and illuminating. They set us on fire only when we are free from special preoccupations. And I would think that, just as a side, that all of us who have prepared papers and presentations for this meeting, I'm sure had at multiple times been sitting at their desk or lying awake in the bed staring at the ceiling of trying to figure out, what am I going to talk about? No? Whether that applies to any of you or not, probably doesn't. I'm the only one who's had that experience, but I think it's a general framework here that we all can identify ourselves with. I would like to cite a third Dewey passage bearing upon the scope of the role of alterity in the dialogical grammar of creativity, the engagement with the other in multiple senses of the word. It generalizes essential aspects of the material dimensions of this grammar and the interactions, indeed dynamic fusion of inner and outer in creative processes. Such a theme is given illuminating and wide-ranging discussion in the architects Christopher Bart's Material in Mind and Giovanni Palamas's The Thinking Hand. Dewey writes, with respect to the physical materials that enter into the formation of a work of art, everyone knows that they must undergo change. Marble must be chipped, pigments must be laid on canvas, words must be put together. It is not so generally recognized that a similar transformation takes place on the side of inner materials, images, observations, memories, and emotions. They are also progressively reformed. They too must be administered. This modification is the building up of a truly expressive act. The impulsion that seethes as a commotion demanding utterance must undergo as much and as careful management in order to receive eloquent manifestations as marble or pigment, as sounds and colors. Nor are there, in fact, two operations, one performed on the outer material and the other upon the inner and mental stuff. The work is artistic in the degree in which the two functions of transformation are effected by a single operation. As the painter places pigment upon the canvas or imagines it placed there, his ideas and feelings are also ordered. As the writer composes in his medium of words what he wants to say, his idea takes on for him perceptible form. In this process of interactions with materials and the development of an expressive form or utterance, Dewey holds that the self is modified beyond acquisition of greater facility and skill. Interaction is a process of sedimentation, resulting in a deposit of meaning involving formation of habits, attitudes, interests. Dewey, as I have noted, calls this condition fundedness, a kind of experiential capital that is constitutive of the self and supports the self's multiple dimensions of noting and caring for things and setting life purposes. Dewey considers this fundedness of experience to be the key to mind as the background upon which every new contact with surroundings is projected, a notion close to Goethe and Dewey's connecting of assimilation and responsive reconstruction. This background is not a passive screen. Experience is a dynamic spiral of assimilation and reconstruction of both background and of what is taken in and digested, a central point developed in his classical 1896 essay on the reflex arc concept in psychology. The multidimensional experiential field is a range of material resistances and affordances, of oppositional tensions that stimulate the imagination, functioning as enabling conditions for arriving at novel, satisfactory consummations, whether affective, practical, aesthetic, political, educational, theoretical, and so far. The mind in Dewey's conception is in his active and eager background, and that lies in wait, of course, as we know, whatever. I have to make sure here that I'm not repeating my sentence. Well, I'll read it anyway. Mind in Dewey's conception then is itself an active and eager background that lies in wait and engages whatever comes its way so as to absorb it into its own being. And then, of course, the last statement here, its animus is toward further interactions. So this process is a process not of closure, but actually a form of closure that is itself an opening. And that's why we often say, I have another treatment of this or something. Well, why would you have another one if you could have treated it and been done with it? But I think that in the case of dialogues, that's why there's always the filling of a gap between what has been said and what still needs to be said that is felt as in a consensual form of everybody has the same sense there must be something more to be said about this in whatever case it may be. The third section deals with exemplifications and extensions, a little more examples and not just theory. Using the language of alchemy, James Elkins has given a strong, at times bewildering, and certainly challenging meditation on the materiality of painting. His focus, like Nigel Wentworth in his book, The Phenomenology of Painting, is on the act of painting and the kinds of thoughts that are taken to be embedded in paint itself. Paint records the most delicate gesture and the most tense. Painting is an unspoken, and largely uncognized dialogue where paint speaks silently in masses and colors, and the artist responds in moods. Indeed, Elkins continues, the meanings embedded in paintings preserve the motions that generate them, In that sense, the material surface of the painting is very different from the material surface of a text. It's not as easy to erase whole parts of a painting as it is to tear up 3 pages of a text and rewrite them. Indeed, Elkins continues, the meanings embedded in painting preserve the motions that generate them. Painters can sense those motions in the paint, even before they notice what the paintings are about. And so can the perceivers of the paintings. Wentworth gives a nuanced and convincing defense and an illustration of the thesis that each material has its own qualitative nature. His analysis of the intertwining of brush, paint, and gesture as material supports of pictorial meaning is complemented by a fine account of the plastic elements of color, line, tone, texture, form, and composition that function on the border between the semiotic and the only seemingly non-semiotic, as well as between expression and figuration. Verbal art, though admittedly with a different field, is also embedded in and permeated by language's paradoxical materiality, which is likewise wedded to the power of abstract distancing. Now, that text is taken from a book about poetry The Seamless Web by Stanley Burnshaw. And strangely enough, it intersects with and even fuses with what Elkin says about painting. In Making, another book here, the cultural anthropologist Tim Ingold writes of an improvisorial creativity that works things out as it goes along, in contrast to the attribution of creativity to the novelty of determinate ends conceived in advance, which only have to be realized. Certainly, language-mediated dialogues exhibit such an improvisatory character, even in the domain of inner speech, as Vygotsky showed, in the flow of word and counterword and the felt traces of contrary tendencies and the field of consciousness. Clearly, there are also times when the ends are determinate by means of an experimentally foreseen interaction of materials, and there are times when the end is only attained when one recognizes that a process of interaction has come to a conclusion that feels right or corresponds to a sense of conclusion, such as finding the right word to dissolve what seems a radical disagreement, and thereby to create a sense of comity as social bond, or the realization that a poem is finished, the last stroke applied to a canvas or a line drawn on paper. Ingold argues and shows with a wealth of examples that making, in the sense of which he is using the term, must be understood longitudinally as a confluence of forces and materials, a form-generating or morphogenetic process. Ingold thinks of both organisms and artifacts in dynamic terms as growing, as embodied matrices of processes. What an organism has in mind is, to be sure, quite different from the varying degrees of human involvement in the making of an artifact. Ingold makes an indispensable point when he writes, even if the maker has a form in mind, it is not this form that creates the work. It is the engagement with materials. Is this not also the case of speech and its essentially dialogical structure? Language, too, involves active transformation of material, funded semiotic material that supports and mediates the utterance that is appropriate and fitting to the dialogical situations in which we find ourselves and engage one another, whether writer, artist, architect, teacher, or politician. That's unfortunately what happened in America with the of finding the right configuration of materials that have led all of us to begin to maybe open a liquor store or a wine store to as consolation. But it's an illustration of the same problem altogether. For Ingold, learning is understanding and practice, exploring the interrelations between perception, creativity, and skill. Is not the fostering of creativity dependent on developing frameworks for various practices, educational, political, communal, and so forth, that aim principally at the development of perception and skill and not directly at creativity? The perceived ongoing possibilities of materials in the broadest sense and of dialogical encounters with them in diverse situations, both singularly and in groups, provoke self-reflection on their successes and on the interruption and lack of focus attendant upon their failure. Such skills involve what Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge and entail a subsidiary, not a focal knowledge of the maxims that inform our practices and how we manage to go on with them with an accompanying sense of being on the right track. One anecdote that's connected with this, Polanyi was a famous scientist and a Hungarian scientist who had worked with Einstein, but he gives us one of his examples of this, that a Dutch electronics firm built a plant in Hungary, and the plant that was was originally in Holland was a kind of paradigm experimental one that was working very successfully. So they built the factory, hired everybody that they needed to staff it, and it never produced one light bulb. They couldn't figure out how to put the processes together because underlying the material processes that are needed in producing a particular product, there was the skill of the people operating and in control of the processes. So in a certain sense, we have here a non-artistic or non-aesthetic account of a type of skill, a type of knowledge that cannot be formulated or put in a handbook. For Ingold, learning is understanding and practice, exploring the interrelations between perception, creativity, and skill. Is not the fostering of creativity then dependent on developing frameworks for various practices? For example, a meeting such as this has offered us a framework for various practices, and you think of the diverse nature of our contributions for larger settings, smaller settings, textual analyses, historical reconstruction, the various types of things that if you put them all together on a page and showed them to somebody who was not trained in philosophy or experienced going to meetings, they would say, how could you talk about all of those things and within one framework of people? How would you collect a set of people who could explore those issues in ways that they hung together? And you would say, well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and it can be done, but it's also because we all have the similar backgrounds, practice backgrounds, analytical practice backgrounds that enable us to do this. Ingold, in a discussion of building in early society, refers to what he calls creativity of messy practices that give rise to real buildings, a theme treated with concrete nuance and Ioannis Palasmas, the thinking hand. Architecture, he writes, is a product of the knowing hand. The hand grasps physicality, grasps the physicality and materiality of thought, and turns it into concrete image. In the arduous processes of designing, the hand often takes the lead in probing for a vision, a vague inkling that eventually turns into a sketch, a materialization of an idea. Messy practices mark the whole realm of dialogical interactions, which have not a stable but a dynamic and often unstable center and field of forces. Messy practices involve starting and stopping, interruptions, extended pauses, diversions, attempts at domination and control, and so forth. Indeed, texts, ordered conversation, works of art, democracy and the institutions and practices of schooling emerge out of and are examples of such messy practices. These practices are always confronted by what Polanyi in another context referred to as a logical gap between where one is situated and where one is heading to, although one cannot get a firm grip on it before crossing the gap. Once you're across the gap, you realize, oh, I was in another place, but now I'm truly in a new place. In such situations, which mark life itself, crossing the gap is not principally a feat of operative action, but an event into which we are caught up and to which we can, indeed must, accommodate ourselves. And I was talking in the break about two scientific examples of this. One dealt with Kekule's discovery of the chemical structure of benzene. And he had spent years desperately seeking what the chemical structure of the molecular structure of benzene was, etc. And one night he didn't sleep very well, but then he fell asleep and had an incredible dream, where he dreamed of what the structure of benzene was. So it turns out he went and did the calculations and fiddled around and he realized it was right. The dream, the discovery found him in a dream, and it wasn't anything that he himself did. It was something that happened to him. And the second example we were talking about was an anecdote about Poincaré, the famous French mathematician and physicist, who had been obsessed with a mathematical problem and that nobody else had been able to solve, and he could not solve either. He was just so exhausted and frustrated that he said, if I could speak Greek, to hell with it. So he said, I'm going to forget about it. I'm not going to bother with it. So he was taking public transportation in Paris, and we was waiting for a bus, thinking about nothing but getting on the bus. And when he took his first step on the bus, the solution came to him. And he wrote a book on the nature of scientific discovery. But once again, by releasing, you actually gain something. So the release from striving gives you a final way of crossing the logical gap between unknowing and knowing. Creativity is clearly a process then involving our being caught up in dynamic fields of forces. Looked at semiotically, as cultural psychologists do, it is an activity undertaken in already formed cultural meaning fields, including fields of materials and material objects, whose possibilities afford, as well as resist, creative transformation by technology and the arts. Looked at practically, it is a field of possible and appropriate social actions, including the core political and educational contexts of our lives. But creativity, as my two other examples showed you, is also an event that seems to spring from nowhere. It seems to bring insight from nowhere. Some have described this nowhere as the unconscious, or as we saw in Dewey's case, the subconscious, perhaps a more neutral term. Creativity as an event cannot be willed or controlled, although there are certain practices of various sorts that facilitate it. It cannot be constructed like a house or a wall from a plan worked out in detail beforehand. Liszka, an architect, offers a schema of these practices in her book, The Storm of Creativity, as does Rosamund Harding in her Anatomy of Inspiration. Liszka, as a practicing architect who happens to be married to the Bart guy that I, 2 pages before, wrote the other book on material and mind, writes that the creative process comes from displacing, disturbing, and destabilizing what you think you know. These preconceptions, which we can perhaps think of more generally as force structures, paradoxically both foster and hinder creativity. Preconceptions are not just in our head. They are also habits of feeling, tendencies to act, the stubborn or temperamental material that we cannot leave behind that are clung to by means of those practices that make up what Peirce called in his fixation of belief the method of tenacity. Forgetting is difficult, Liszka points out, citing Ortega y Gasset, that the culture in which we have been formed can become the guarantor of a deceptive safety, burdened with parasitic and lymphatic matter. Creativity or creative action is marked by the effort to try and see ahead, while being deeply conditioned by the past and the traditional methods and concepts which are both exploited and overcome. I ran across a sentence about the pianist Hélène Grimaud while writing this essay that captures a number of aspects of the bound nature of creativity that perhaps applies to all of us who are connected with the world of Homo academicus, with its complex relations between teaching established contents and the putative production of new ideas. Here's what she writes, or here's what has been written about her. She has this willingness to take a piece of music apart and free herself from the general body of practice that has grown up around it. The music world, in its great diversity, has come to distinguish multiple roles for its practitioners. There are composers, performers, and conductors. These roles clearly can be fused in certain circumstances and have a long history of shifting relations and ascription of status. In Grimaud's case, she is a classical pianist with a broad repertoire and deep familiarity with the general body of practice that marks not just music, but art, science, and philosophy. I am especially moved by a performance recorded in Berlin of Ferruccio Bessoni's transcription of what Anthony Tomasini contended was not a transcription, but rather visionary reconstruction for piano of the Chaconne from Bach's Partita for Solo Violin No. 2. Some of you may know that if you, maybe some of you are violinists, but I have been obsessed with Hélène Grimaud. I'd probably be arrested as a musical stalker of watching this performance on multiple occasions. It's utterly riveting. She did it totally open in on the concert hall of the Berlin Philharmonic. and she walks out upon the stage, no score, no nothing, and she performs this unspeakably complex piece of music. I even get shivers now, even not mentioning it. Recorded in Berlin of Ferruccio Busoni's transcription of the partita. Busoni, however, who wrote the transcription, took upon himself to make it a reconstruction of something that is still identifiable as Bach's chaconne. So you say, that's Bach's chaconne, but that's not Bach's chaconne. So it is and it is not exactly what it is. The paradox, it's truly a paradoxical endeavor on his part, but we also know that Bach himself did this to other musicians. So there's a constant tradition here of reconstruction and reformulation of previous works, just as we do the same thing in the construction and reconfiguration of previous ideas and previous forms of thought. But it also, but it's very clear though that everybody who hears this, who goes to hear this this performance, which is on YouTube, easily available on YouTube, went there because they wanted to see this marvel or to experience this marvel of something what it is and is not what it is, and how this could be done, because it's a remarkable exposition of muscle memory and aesthetic memory, all combined. At the same time, this work itself is accessed for those of us who are not pianists or readers of the score through Grimaud's performance, and in many ways is mixed with memories of his performance on the violin. So you hear in the background, even though you're listening to a piano, you know that this is the piano's love affair with a violin. In our broad, this is the last, there's no text. Well, anyway, let's keep going. This is the last two paragraphs. In our broad philosophical, scientific, artistic endeavors, are we not challenged to take apart by attentive critical appropriation the vitally important topics we are drawn to, locating them in the general body of practices out of which they have emerged and been shaped, and giving voice to them in new ways? Is this not the type of task that is the paradoxical, even petulant demand for and recognition of an intrinsically indebted originality and creativity imposes on us? Does Pascal perhaps have something to say about a feeling most of us have had at some time in our lives, perhaps even in the course of preparing our papers? This is a passage from Pascal's Pensées. He says, "Let no one say that I have said nothing new." This is the thing, a problem or a fear that all of us have, and if we have to stand up and give a presentation. Pascal writes, "Let no one say that I have said nothing new. The arrangement of the material is new. In playing tennis, both players use the same ball, but one plays it better. I would just as soon be told that I have used old words, as if the same thoughts did not form a different argument by being differently arranged, just as the same words make different thoughts when arranged differently." Thank you for your attention. I have to admit that I wasn't sitting at the table. I have never, ever taught sitting down. And I find that a couple of years ago at this meeting where we were meeting in the large aula, I was speaking, I think, about the philosophy of architecture, and I said, I'm not going to sit behind the table. I'm going to go out. I'm going to mix with the group. So I simply went around and I stood on the floor, and did not use a microphone. But if you've ever had courses in public speaking, you're told, aim to the outer wall. So I aimed to the outer wall from one point of view, and it gave, I think, a slightly closer, a closer feel with of what happens when you are talking about abstract things, but perhaps in a closer and in a closer way. So well, Arthur's in charge. I'm so used to being in charge of meetings, having been a department chairperson, that it's strange that I would even want to continue on in this vein. Arthur, you're in charge now.
Thank you, Bob. Bob.
Do you want to see there?
Yeah. Oh, careful. We have 10 minutes for questions. 10 minutes. Don't be shy.
Thank you, Bob. This is just a question about, well, it has something to do, I guess, with this deep, it has something to do with the fact that greatness is also indebtedness. And very interesting, I think, point that Peirce likes to make as well. It's just a simple question of whether or not Dewey's reverie and Peirce's musement are equivalent, or if there's some difference there that's worth developing.
Is this on?
Yes.
That's a very, very interesting question. It has there's other things in the background there that is the general relationship between Peirce and Dewey, which is both amicable and non-amicable in a polite sense. If I could step back just for one step from your question, that is, Dewey wrote a very interesting paper called Peirce's Theory of Quality. And he made an astounding claim. Well, not astounding. I think it's a very interesting and I think perhaps even correct claim that Peirce's most important contribution was his theory of quality, not his theory of science. And near the end of his life in 1940, I think it was in 1946, he published a paper in the Journal of Philosophy called Peirce's Theory of Language, Signs, and Meaning. I think that was the full title, where he says once again that Peirce gives us a good theory of inquiry, but he says this semiotic stuff has to go. That there's not anything really unique. Dewey was arguing there. So we have this sort of background to what Dewey and Peirce, what the relationship between Dewey's and Peirce's philosophical projects would be. Now, Peirce's theory of quality obviously leads to the possibility of a Peircean aesthetics, which very definitely does exist. As a matter of fact, I taught a whole course here in 2019 to the postdocs specifically on that topic. So where we would go from there, right, to making a specification, is I think something perhaps one would have to study on or talk about in a more limited circumstances. I think we can, unless you're going to be heading for an airplane very, very soon, I think we should have a chance to have we sit in the lobby with a beer and we can This is like a jailbreak where the warden has left the cells unlocked.
Bob, I have one brief remark. I thought that was perfect. I thought it was perfect. I thought you articulated the theory and you exemplified the theory and you did so artfully. Thank you.
I didn't hear your question. I heard you said you had a remark. Look, we Vincent and I send previous manuscripts to one another to make sure that that we're not locked in the cell. That so would you supply me the keys to get out of this cell that I'm in? And so it's that is the form of our So could you reformulate that?
Can you tell? Can you ask again? He hasn't heard you.
What?
Yes, you did.
Bob, I said it was perfect. You just wanted me to say it again. I said theoretically.
Look, I was at a university was filled with Jesuit professors, and the model for the Jesuits is repetitio mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of learning. Right? So that's no. Thank you very much.
I thought theoretically, in terms of exemplification, it was quite perfect, and I thought the whole thing was artfully done.
Thank you.
Thanks again. It was wonderful. You asked what lies beneath creativity and suggest an argue for maturation. I was wondering, in the contemporary context of artificial intelligence, mechanical creativity, maturation just disappears. So what can we do now to preserve creativity?
Probably not try. From one point of view, right? There's two. The real issue is it's a kind of active passivity of not of cease striving, and there will be self-transformation. You find that in Chuang Tzu of cease striving, and there will be self-transformation. But in a certain case, creative activity involves the activities are pulled out of one. They're not pushed out of one. The more you push, you find it doesn't work. But it involves sort of killing one's own children. One is not willing. Once you have produced something, a painting or a work of art, a poem, it's very difficult to put it in the waste paper basket and or to not want to defend it against all of its opponents. You know, it's your child and it's emerged out of long background fermentation in you, etc. So, but the artificial intelligence issue, I was going to I had a sentence or two that it came to mind as I was reading the paper, but it's more of a comment on my part right now. Was that the places that I wanted to make these insertions, I couldn't because since I had the microphone was in between me and my text. So I was reading around the microphone and bypassed the point where this could occur. But the question about the creativity of AI systems and the creativity of the chatbot, that whole thing. There's a gigantic literature also, but in phenomenology. Started with Hubert Dreyfus's book on what computers can't do. Then years later, he wrote another book called What Computers Still Can't Do. The issue there is what are the levels of operation that are taking place in AI? And is there any point where there is truly a novel emergent level that could not have been predicted from the antecedent conditions. So if you have, say, if you were talking about computer painting, or whether AI you could have a painting that has been produced, however that would occur, right? That where the motions of the brushes would be derived from a program. I don't know whether you should really use, whether this would be a way of approaching that issue of maturation versus production and whatever. I'm assuming that I'm answering, or I'm talking about the question that you were asking. I mean, there's a long, long literature on this now in art theory and people in the philosophy of art, but I have never been able to truly get my head around it because I'm so much convinced of the utter materiality of thinking and of recording thoughts and of generating thoughts with the matter of the tools and or whatever in artificial intelligence with the computer scores that are controlling whatever else that is happening in that domain.
Last question. Vinicius.
Here comes trouble.
No, not at all. No, it struck me when you said that creativity is also an event. And I tried to elaborate it because I always thought it as a process. And then it came to my mind a metaphor that Ivo has been working on, that the unconscious, that's Peirce's idea. The unconscious is like a bottomless lake in which things surface in a continuous way. So they go up and down. And I wanted to, if you could elaborate this idea that creativity being an event instead of a process.
It's very clear to me that you're referring to that famous text of Peirce, consciousness is a bottomless lake, at which different objects are found at different levels, but then certain forces put them into motion, and then they interact with, and then all of a sudden you have the event of a structure emerging or a configuration of ideas, etc. I say, yes, that's actually true, but and I think that's a very clear example that phenomenologically would give us access to the process nature of creativity. But we all have had the experience, that's why I used the examples of Poincaré and the other types of things of aha, it's happened. I understand what is going on. But that's also the same thing of when does a painter put the brush down? Namely, stop, because we've all had the experience. If you've been if you're an artist or writer, or which we all are in one sense, these things of what happens when you say, I ruined this. I remember when I was younger, I did a lot of drawing, and I do watercolors, but I did a lot of drawing. And I live in a house now, a very old house, 200-year-old house that has a 30-foot loggia, long loggia, Italianate loggia with the brick floor and the columns and everything. We have all of them. And there's vegetation, plants and tomato plants, whatever growing along the side. And I was sitting one summer, I was in the evening or in the late afternoon, and I took out my pen and stuff, and I sketched the configuration of pillars and the vines growing up, the sweet autumn growing. And I worked on it for several hours, and my wife, I showed it to my wife, and which I never should have, and she said, I think right there's something else that is lacking. She said, there's a slight shading there that should be made more intense. So I did it. And I looked at it and I said, and I tore it up and threw it away. Now, I had the chance that every man has, but you want to say, it's your wife or your husband, it's your fault. But it wasn't her fault. I knew it was finished, right? because I had been going through the process and I knew just exactly what the tonal differences should have been. But I think we see the same thing when we write texts and things of this sort, or if we're, or perhaps if we are a choreographer. You know, Renata knows everything. She knows much more about this than I do, I can assure you. But how do you get from the rough choreographic score to the actual realization of the score, and to what degree it works? And I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say, okay, Renata, come up here and talk to us now about the pre-structuring of a dance. But I think that the dancers, when themselves ultimately find out what works and what doesn't work, and my guess is that would be any choreographer who doesn't himself or herself dance would be missing a tacit knowledge of the movements of the body. So I think this occurs also in mathematics and in science, and of what happened to the poor Hungarians who could not get the whole plant to work, this multi-billion-dollar plant. I mean, I have a friend here who probably could say whether that works, but I won't call upon him to talk to us, but about that. But he will tell me afterwards whether how that is even possible, or what makes it possible to put an industrial, say, establishment, industrial plant or whatever it would be into a culture where the workman had no prior tacit knowledge of these processes, of how these things work. And in that case, we're back to what the original thing of a process and event, and the tacit background of all of these various things.
Thank you very much, Bob. Before we end this session, Lucia, Luisa, Adriana have a little word to say.
But what did you say?
They are guys. Thank you for your testing.
Did it work?
The test you sent us is, I think, an earlier version of that. That's why we stopped so they could see you on the screen.
Oh, that's fine. Oh, of course, it doesn't matter. I just only happened to look over.
And I figure as an artist, I have figured myself while I paint when you were talking.
Good. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
And I don't think we ask you 3 moments to thank Professor Ibri. We want the members of the Center of Studies of Pragmatism want to make a tribute for him as our leader. So, com imenso prazer, os membros do Centro de Estudos de Pragmatismo orgulhosamente parabenizam o professor Ivo Assad Ibri pelo prêmio Herbert Schneider, da Society of the Advancement of American Philosophy, conferido em face de sua brilhante trajetória acadêmica no campo dos estudos filosóficos. Neste ato, recebo o professor Dr. Ivo Assad Ibn, as nossas mais sinceras homenagens e agradecimentos por toda a sua dedicação aos estudos do pragmatismo e por generosamente nos guiar nesse caminho. Essa é a carta que o professor Ibn recebeu. This is the letter that he received and sent for us. And we were very, very proud and fortunate that we can have him as our leader, guider, and master. So we ask you all to
Vem cá, professor. Ele não vem aqui?
vem, por favor, professor Ivo. We are now speaking for all your students that all of this year have the great opportunity to have you as our professor and friend and father and every what yes.
Nosso presente para você.
This is a gun? No.
No. It's much better.
To open, you have to share with us. Oh. Wow.
Para brindar, né?
Yeah. You know, all of you, she is a sommelier. Yeah. Specialist in wine. So. Thank you.
Obrigada, professor. Parabéns.
Thank you. Let's make well, thank you. It was a big surprise. And well, I'm quite touched by this unexpected homage coming from my students, from my ex-students. They are all PhDs. And well, it was my honor to receive this prize. It was a big surprise. And I shared it with my team. You know, because along my long career in this university, and sharing my work with great pleasure with all my students, all my colleagues, not in Brazil and international colleagues. And well, this is a reward, a tremendous reward for a very hard work we always are performing. I said some times ago, I said to Nathan or to Innis that I admire that let's remember the rock como é que chama aquele conjunto de rock em inglês? Conjunto de rock em inglês? Não, the Beatles. The other one. Rolling Stone. I said, our group is not the Rolling Stone, Hanging Stones. So thank you very much. And well, I appreciate very much this surprise and my embrace, my kiss to all of you, and thank you, my deep from my heart. Okay. I'd like to have 5 minutes of a break, and then I will return to, yeah, to the ending of this conference. Okay. Thank you. 5 minutes. Excellent. Did it work? Good. I like it a lot. So prepare it for journey.
Se despede dele, a Adriana que escolheu, né? Aí a caixa não fica.
So I'm glad
Fecha a porta lá. Tá, deixa. Ok. Bom, chegou o momento de encerrar, né, essa festa toda, né? Então, eu preparei. Tá projetando aqui, não? Alguém vai mexer aqui? Aqui está projetado em inglês, eu vou falar em inglês também. And before ending this conference, I would like to pay a homage as a memorial to our dear colleagues Christopher Hookway and Christina Di Gregori, Chris from England and Christina from Argentina, and to say something. And I would like to invite Professor Colapietro to say some words on this memorial. If you can come here, please. Yeah. Tá funcionando isso? Tem duas aqui, né? Bom. We'll say something on behalf of all of us. Okay.
We are genuinely a community. Nobody has theorized community more profoundly than Royce, whom first thought understood his pragmatism better than James. And for Royce, a community is always at least a community of hope and a community of memory. Please indulge me. I want to say a word or two about hope. First said, despair is insanity. We live in a world in which the most qualified expression of hope is met with utter cynicism. Our hopelessness is artificially manufactured. Don't you ever be hopeless. Please, I want all the young people in this room to stand up. I want all the young scholars to stand up at this moment. However self-delusional you might be. Up. Nathan, you're young. You're young. You are my hope. I am dead serious here. You are my hope. The younger you are, the more hopeful I am for this world. Don't you ever let anybody own your hope, own your heart by seducing you into despair. The only way we are powerless is if we think we're powerless, and we think we're powerless the moment we think we have no hope. So never, but never. So it's easier to imagine the death of the earth than the end of capitalism. Well, you know what? We're going to start reimagining the way we inhabit this earth, reimagining beyond the limits of the ideological imagination that has been imposed on. You can sit down now. You're great. We are a community of hope, and the young people, be you 80 or be you 24 or be you whatever, give me hope. But we are also a community of memory, and that means we are a community of commemoration. We will not allow for our members to go unmarked. A death requires a communal acknowledgement. There will be people I'm missing, and I apologize. But two people who were very important in these meetings were Christopher Hookway and Christina Di Gregorio. And I became fast friends with Christina. She invited me to give a series of lectures. She translated my those lectures into Spanish. My last book is in Spanish. And so I owe her a deep debt. She was a good friend only for a all too short while. There are others who were not part of this meeting, but they were part of this meeting. And that would be Don Roberts and Beverly Kent, who were very important for both Alita and for Nathan. So I would like to just be silent and in a moment of memory for those whom we have lost, both those named and unnamed. Please, let's just be silent. There are more genres of silence than there are of music or literature. And I think moments of reverential silence for deep loss is not a bad thing. It could be a healing thing. Thank you.
Emotions and emotions. We're coming to the closing of 23rd International Meeting on Pragmatism, which mark 26 years of continuous work of our Center for Pragmatism Studies. It was especially dedicated to our friend, Professor Nathan Hauser, and we all do hope he could feel all our respect and very deep affection for him. I used to thank primarily our sponsors, CAPES and CNPq. Moreover, the precious support we received from D'Artagnan Vasconcelos Júnior, Fábio Rosas, Ideia Viva, Escola de Cultura, José Luiz Zanetti, Maria das Graças Nascimento, Thomas Druckenmel, Vera Maria Zugaib. I especially believe that all of us must thank the efficiency of our organizational team whose assistance made this event possible, from its planning until its execution, which today we conclude. At this moment, I mention each one by name. Firstly, I ask the audience to applaud with me the leaders of this team, Eloisa Gizzi, Professor Lúcia de Souza Dantas, and almost Dr. Professor Adriana Teixeira. Well, these are the names we all need to say thank you. Scientific Committee, Arthur Araújo, Cassiano Terra Rodrigues, Heloísa Gizzi, José Luiz Zanetti, Lucas Antônio Saran, Lúcia de Souza Dantas, Renan Baggio. Projects and Reports, Heloísa Gizzi, Júlio César de Oliveira, Lucas Antônio Saran, D'Artagnan Vasconcelos Jr. Translation of the Test, Ryan Hoke. Identidade Visual, Visual Identity, Raquel Ponte. Abstract Book Proofreading, Heloísa Gizzi, Giovanni Colino, Luiz Carneiro. Book Cover, Raquel Ponte. Book Graphic Design and Final Layout, Luma Santos de Oliveira. Website, Lúcia de Souza Dantas. Social Media and YouTube, Lúcia de Souza Dantas. a lot, a lot of work. Social communication, Adriana Teixeira. Supporting team, Bárbara Beatriz Silvestre Sampaio, our hostess in the opening. Kaique Marra de Mello, Cristiane Maier, ou Meyer, D'Artagnan Vasconcelos, Luma de Santos Oliveira, Giovanni Colino, Luiz Carneiro, Renata Silva Souza, Ryan Hoke, Silvana Borges, Thomas Durkenbaum. The opening concert, the soprano Luciana Fischer, the piano Daniel Greggio, the contrabaixo Zé Ross Santos. All special thanks to conference and roundtable lecturers, lecture session chairs, roundtable chairs and proponents, communication session chairs. And we invite you all lecturers and people who presented communication papers to submit their texts to our journal Cognitio, which publishes in a continuous flow and enjoys a A2 classification by CAPES. You may all pay a visit to the journal website and follow the instructions, like in the screen. In our opening conference, I wish to all a week of good studies, learning, and a fertile exchange of ideas. At the end of this journey, I hope these objectives have been accomplished. May this academic event continue to fructify and grow, and may all be with us once more in our future meeting that we intend to realize in 2025, in November 3 to 6. So block in your agenda this week, since now, as a presential one. We believe that this 23rd meeting has run reasonably with what had been planned, and we are satisfied and happy because of this. We were able to maintain our tradition of cordial and cooperative debate with respect towards the work and research of each one. With our warmest Brazilian embrace to all of you, on behalf of our team that hardly have worked during this week, I would like to say from the deep of our heart, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. Finish. A big picture with all of you.
Venham todos para uma foto, todos. Todos, todas, todos.
Todos, todas e todes. Que horror. Eu acho um horror isso. Eu acho assim, ó, ficar aqui atrás, convidado, né? E apagar essa tela aqui, ó.